Okay, this is my week 4 assignment for this class. So, first we're going to just take a look at who got the right to vote and when, which was one of the provided resources, and I kind of just made a little bit of a breakdown in a more simplistic version of this. So, between 1776 and 1868, voting rights restricted to white male property owners, gradual extensions to the white men without property, and some women. I was not aware that it was granted to some women. Next, we've got 1870 to 1920. The 15th and the 19th Amendments grant voting rights to African American men and women, though many still face barriers like literacy tests and poll taxes. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act is passed, prohibiting discriminatory voting practices and increasing voter protections for marginalized groups. In 1971 to 1993, voting age was lowered to 18, and voting rights expanded with reforms like the National Voter Registration Act and multilingual materials. And from 2000 to present, ongoing issues with voter suppression, felon disenfranchisement, and legal challenges to voting laws, including the weakening of the Voting Rights Act in 2013. So, excuse me. This is a quote based on the text that was provided that addresses the different notions of equality rights and citizenship held by various groups in the early United States. The right to vote during the colonial and revolutionary periods is restricted to property owners, most of whom are white males, Protestants over the age of 21. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ends the Mexican-American War and guarantees U.S. citizenship to Mexicans living in the territories conquered by the U.S. However, English language requirements and violent intimidation limit access to voting rights. So this reflects the exclusion of many groups such as black men, both free and enslaved, and women from the full rights of citizenship and voting in the early U.S. It shows how white men, especially property owners, held the most significant notions of equality and citizenship, while black men, free and enslaved, and women, particularly black women, were either excluded or severely restricted in their rights. Okay, so this is reflecting on celebrating women's suffrage, but don't whitewash the movement's racism. As part of so Auntie Lee's pastor inspired her to vote, emphasizing the importance of fulfilling her civic duties. Growing up in the South, Auntie Lee witnessed the disenfranchisement of black people, including poll taxes, literacy tests, and violence aimed at preventing voting. The author links this personal story to broader historical themes, specifically examining the intersectionality of race and gender. The narrative of women's suffrage celebrated at events like the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention largely excluded black women, although figures like Sojourner Truth and Mary Church Terrell fought for women's rights. Their contributions were often overshadowed or controlled by white suffragists. The author argues that the history of women's suffrage in the U.S. is complex, shaped by white supremacy and the country's foundational injustices. They call for a more inclusive celebration of suffrage, honoring both historical figures like Harriet Tubman and Shirley Chisholm, as well as contemporary activists like the founders of Black Lives Matter. The struggle for equal voting rights, especially for black women, continues to this day, as seen in Auntie Lee's enduring commitment to vote. So, how did their notions of equality and rights correspond? So, here's how the notions of equality and rights of various groups correspond in using quotes from this text. So for white men, the text reflects the systemic privileges white men held in early America, saying that the right to vote during the colonial and revolutionary periods is restricted to property owners, most of whom are white males Protestants over the age of 21. This shows how rights and equality were predominantly aligned with property ownership and race, limiting the political power to anyone outside of the demographic. So for black men, rights were severely limited despite legal gains like the 15th Amendment. The text highlights how for black people, poll taxes and literary tests and outright violence and intimidation prevented black people from voting. This shows how legal rights were undermined by discriminatory practices, limiting their equality and access to voting. For white women, the suffrage movement primarily focused on white women's rights, especially at events like the Seneca Falls Convention, where the participants were middle and upper class white women, a cadre of white men supporters, and one African American male, Frederick Douglass. The rights and equality of white women were championed, but the movement did not fully consider the intersectionality of race, neglecting black women's struggles. For black women, their rights and equality were doubly restricted by both racism and sexism. The text notes that no black women attended the convention and none were invited. This exclusion highlights how black women were left out of the larger suffrage discussions and their needs were marginalized within the broader fight for women's rights. These different notions of equality and rights, as seen in the experiences of these groups, reveal how race, class, and gender intersect to shape access to political power and how black women in particular faced compounded forms of oppression. So how did each group mold its public voice? How did each use its power? So again, I broke this up into 4 different subcategories. White men had the most political power and influence in early America, as they were the primary voters and decision makers. Their public voice was strong enough through the control of their political and legal systems. They used their power to create laws that maintained their dominance, such as restricting voting rights to property owners and using violence and intimidation to suppress marginalized groups. Their public voice often remained unquestioned in a society where their rights were the foundation of governance. So for black men, particularly in the 15th Amendment, they began to assert their public voice through legal means like voting and participating in civil rights efforts. However, their power was undermined by systemic practices such as literacy texts and poll taxes. Despite the barriers, black men used their voices through activism, litigation, and organizing, with key figures advocating for equality and civil rights. While their power was limited, their persistent push for voting rights and civil rights allowed them to challenge oppressive systems. White women, particularly after the 19th Amendment, shaped their public voice through suffrage activism. Their power was mobilized by organizing, petitioning, and participation in marches, as seen as the Seneca Falls Convention and later suffrage efforts. While initially focused on white women's issues, their public voice grew over as they formed networks of support and influence legislation. They used their power to advocate for their legal right to vote and greater societal inclusion, though their efforts often excluded black women and other marginalized groups. Lastly, we have black women who faced compounded challenges of racism and sexism, which I mentioned before. This excluded them from mainstream suffrage movements. Despite this, they molded their public voice by creating spaces for themselves within the broader civil rights and women's rights movement. Figures like Sojourner Truth and Mary Church Terrell used their power by speaking out against both racism and sexism, fighting for voting rights and challenging the limitations placed on them. They navigated the intersectionality of their oppression and used their power to influence both Black civil rights and women's suffrage movements, though their voices were often marginalized by white suffragists. So, in conclusion, each group used its power in ways that reflected its social and political position, but the voices of marginalized groups, such as Black men and women, were often suppressed or excluded, requiring them to fight even harder than the others did. Taking a look now at how the suffrage movement betrayed Black women. So, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony's influence. Stanton and Anthony shaped the narrative of the 19th century suffrage movement, but their account overlooked the contributions of Black women and the role of racism in the suffrage struggle. Their version of history, particularly in history of women's suffrage, minimized or ignored the intersectional struggles of Black women and their exclusion from the movement. After the Civil War, tensions arose between Black and white women regarding suffrage, especially with the passage of the 15th Amendment. White suffragists like Stanton expressed racist views, particularly about Black men voting before white women. This racism caused a divide between Black and white feminists, which persists today. Black women, especially in the South, fought for the vote not only for themselves but also for their communities, aiming to protect Black men and families from racial terror. Despite their crucial involvement, Black women were marginalized by the white-dominated suffrage movements, and their needs were often sidelined, even after the passage of the 19th Amendment. Southern Black women faced intense obstacles in exercising their right to vote despite the amendment's passage. So, what voices do we notably not hear during this time in the debate on citizenship? Black women were notably excluded from the debate on citizenship and the suffrage movement. As I mentioned, figures like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were often overlooked or marginalized the voices of Black women. These women's contributions to the suffrage movement were largely rendered invisible in the dominant historical narrative of the time. Frederick Douglass highlights the intersectionality of Black women's struggles, noting, "When women, because they are women, when they are hunted down, when their children are torn from their arms, then they will have an urgency to obtain the ballot equal to our own." Black suffragists like Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell were excluded from key suffrage events and were often discriminated against by white suffragists. The text mentions that black women's suffrage clubs that sought formal affiliation within the national white suffrage movement were discouraged from doing so on the grounds that admitting them might anger white Southerners. These are my citations. Thanks for listening.